The desert wind blew steady across Fort Garnett's open training grounds, kicking up dust between the line of green recruits waiting their turn to fire. It was a standard rifle qualification day, hot sun, nervous grins, and too many kids trying too hard to impress. Then she stepped forward. Quiet. Looked more like a librarian than a soldier. One of the drill instructors chuckled audibly. "You think you'll hit the target with that frame?" He scoffed, nodding toward the small woman tightening her grip on the M24. A few recruits laughed. One mimed collapsing in slow motion, slapping the ground dramatically. But she said nothing. No rolled eyes, no comeback, just a soft exhale as she adjusted her stance, feet shoulder width apart, deliberate and controlled. And then it happened, a moment so subtle it nearly went unnoticed. As she lifted her left arm to adjust the sling, the edge of her training shirt rode up slightly, just enough to reveal a tattoo inked in clean black lines across her side, a coiled snake wrapped tightly around a bullet. The serpent's head faced outward, sharp and poised like it was ready to strike. Someone was watching from behind. Not another recruit, but a man who did recognize it. Colonel Frank Dalton, walking quietly along the firing line, froze mid-step, his breath caught. His eyes locked on that tattoo like he'd seen a ghost. And in a voice barely above a whisper, he muttered, "That's a black viper mark." Suddenly, the laughter died. Her name was Rachel Moore, 20, 8 years old. Light brown hair tied back in a tight bun. Fair skin, calm, unreadable eyes. She didn't speak much, didn't socialize. Most of the younger recruits had already written her off as weird or extra. The girl who always arrived early, stayed late, and voluntarily cleaned other people's rifles. They called her Little Miss Scope, or less kindly, the Ghost. She never responded. From the very first day of sniper certification at Northwest Base, Rachel Moore had asked for one thing: to observe. During practice rounds, she declined to shoot, instead requesting permission to study wind behavior and target movement. One instructor had snapped, "If you're too scared to pull the trigger, why'd you even enlist?" She bowed her head slightly and answered, "I've pulled the trigger before, but I won't do it again unless I'm sure." That only made the laughter louder. "What'd you shoot?" "Soda cans at a gas station," someone joked, and yet there was something off about her stillness. Something off in a way that made your skin prick. It wasn't fear. It was precision, restraint, experience. She handled every rifle like it was sacred, breaking them down into parts, cleaning every bolt and spring with surgical detail, checking optics with the kind of care you only learned when mistakes once cost lives. One recruit later admitted, she cleaned her scope like she was prepping for a funeral. More than just silence, even without a single fired shot, Rachel tracked each exercise with mathematical precision. She calculated wind shifts by watching the angle of grass. She noted the temperature at sunrise and how it affected bullet drop at 800 yards. She didn't just observe, she memorized. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't shyness. It was something else. Sergeant Hal Jennings, a seasoned instructor with 2 tours in Afghanistan, once asked her directly, "Why aren't you firing? You have the skill. That much is clear." She looked at him and said, "Because I need to remember why I stopped." Jennings didn't press further. But others weren't so respectful. The jokes continued. "Maybe she's waiting for the target to apologize first." "You sure you're in the right class, sweetheart? Meditation is down the hall." Still, Rachel said nothing. She kept showing up early, kept wiping down rifles, kept adjusting other people's optics without being asked. And every night, she sat alone at the far end of the range, eyes fixed on the targets as the sun dipped low. If you looked closely, you'd see her fingertips trace the edge of that snake tattoo, again and again. Like it wasn't just ink, like it was memory, like it hurt. Until the colonel spoke that morning, when Rachel finally stepped up to shoot, ordered to fire first despite her silence. No one expected much. Not the recruits, not the instructors, not even Sergeant Jennings. But Colonel Dalton was still there watching. When her shirt lifted again during the rifle adjustment, and that snake revealed itself fully, complete with the letters BV-12 etched into the bullet's casing. One instructor scoffed under his breath. "Kids these days, getting fake tats to look tough." Dalton stepped forward. "Stop," he said sharply. Everyone turned. The colonel's face had gone pale. She was Black Viper, he said, eyes still fixed on the mark. Silence. Actual silence, like the air itself held its breath. One of the younger instructors stammered, but that unit was wiped in the Red Line operation. Officially, no one made it out. Dalton didn't look away. Apparently one did. And suddenly, nothing was the same. Everyone turned to look at Rachel again, but differently now. As if seeing her for the first time, as if the veil of awkwardness had lifted to reveal something far more dangerous. Dalton, still staring, asked in a low voice, "How many were in your unit?" Rachel answered softly, 12. "And how many came back?" She looked him straight in the eye. "You're looking at her." Even the wind seemed to stop. No one understood the full weight of what that meant, but they felt it. They felt it in the way Colonel Dalton's hands had begun to tremble. They felt it in the sudden shuffle of boots as instructors subtly took a step back, no longer mocking. He pointed to the BV-12 on her tattoo. "That's your unit number." She shook her head. "No, sir. That's how many I couldn't save." Rachel Moore didn't fire a single round that week. While the others took their places at the firing line, fumbling with scope adjustments, overcorrecting for wind, arguing with instructors, Rachel stood off to the side, arms crossed behind her back, eyes steady on the targets. Always watching, always silent. She never once asked for a turn. Instead, she arrived before sunrise every morning, quietly unlocking the armory with the assistant quartermaster's permission. When recruits stumbled in half awake, they found their rifles already prepped, wiped clean, bolts oiled, optics cleared of dust. No one asked her to do it, she just did. At first, they thought she was just trying to score favor with the instructors. Then they got annoyed. "You know," said Private Scott Richards one morning, "you don't get extra points for playing janitor." His friends snickered as they slung their rifles over their shoulders. Rachel simply nodded and went back to scrubbing the chamber of a rifle that wasn't hers. The truth was, her movements were too efficient, too precise. She didn't look like she was cleaning. She looked like she was remembering. Every pass of the cloth, every torque of a bolt felt practiced and deliberate, like it mattered, like someone's life had once depended on it. Sergeant Hall Jennings started to notice. She always stood downwind from the others, tracking how the breeze moved through tree branches, how it carried dust across the open field. She often squatted near the base of the targets, fingers grazing the ground, checking for soil moisture and elevation shifts. One afternoon, Jennings walked over to her while she knelt by a bush just outside the 600-yard marker. "Moore, you plan to fire at some point, or are you just cataloging the ecosystem?" She looked up, calm as ever. "I'm studying the drop-off zone." He raised an eyebrow. "Drop-off for what?" She answered without blinking. "The wind changes here by 2 knots after noon. Bullets start drifting right past 500 yards. It wasn't a guess, it was a fact. And it was correct." Still, the grumbling continued. To the younger recruits, her silence wasn't mystery. It was arrogance. Or worse, cowardice. "Maybe she's just scared to miss?" Someone muttered behind her back. "Maybe that tattoo's fake, like a cosplay or something." No matter what they said, Rachel never bit back. She just kept cleaning, kept measuring, kept watching. That bothered them more than if she'd screamed. During one midday break, a group gathered at the mess hall picnic tables. Most of them were sweaty from drills, passing around plastic trays of canned beef and dry cornbread. "She's been here for 2 weeks and hasn't fired a single round," Private Thomas Baker said, loudly enough for her to hear from the adjacent table. "At some point, you gotta ask yourself, is she even real? Maybe she's a plant," joked another. "You know, like psychological warfare. They send her in to make us doubt our own sanity." More laughter. Rachel didn't turn her head. She didn't even flinch. But Sergeant Jennings, who had been sipping black coffee nearby, had finally had enough. He stood up, walked over to her, and asked, "Private Moore, you mind telling me, in plain words, why you haven't fired a single shot in training yet?" The conversation stopped cold. Rachel set down her notebook, a battered green pad filled with careful columns of range data, wind readings, temperature fluctuations, and humidity percentages. She looked up at Jennings and spoke quietly, but with complete clarity. "I've pulled the trigger before, Sergeant." He waited, but she didn't elaborate. She folded her hands on the table. But until I remember why I stopped, she said, I won't do it again. No dramatics, no fanfare. Just that. Jennings looked at her for a long moment, then walked away without another word. But something in the way he moved afterward, the slight change in his posture, suggested he wouldn't be treating her like the others anymore. Still, most of the recruits didn't get it. They saw a woman who refused to shoot in sniper school. That was all they needed. Later that week, the instructors added a new drill: rapid fire bolt action target acquisition. 5 rounds, 5 targets, 100 seconds. Rachel didn't volunteer. She simply took notes from the sidelines, tracking the trajectory of each shot the others took, the time delay between reloads, the rifle recoil angles. Someone tossed a sarcastic remark her way. Hope those notes help when the paper starts shooting back. But privately, the instructors had begun reading those notes. Sergeant Jennings glanced at one of her entries during cleanup and saw it was written in shorthand code from the Army's Advanced Field Ballistics Manual. Classified material, not available in standard issue training, and yet she wrote it by memory. The only people he'd ever seen use it fluently were snipers who'd served in the real black zones. The ones with no name on a map. The ones where you never sent in a platoon. You sent in 3 people and hoped at least one made it out. There was more too. On day 7, she was found in the armory after hours, adjusting the torque specs on the trigger assemblies of 3 malfunctioning rifles. No manual, no schematic, just instinct. How do you know what values to set? The assistant tech asked. By weight, she replied. I remember how much it should feel in your hand. From that moment on, Jennings stopped questioning her background. And though he didn't say it aloud, he started leaving the long-range scopes unlocked in the early morning, knowing she'd calibrate them before the others arrived. The recruits, however, still didn't understand what they were looking at. They saw a woman who cleaned, measured, adjusted, calculated. But what they failed to see, at least for now, was a woman preparing for something they couldn't yet imagine. Because Rachel Moore wasn't avoiding the shot. She was waiting for the moment she'd have to take it again, and making damn sure, when that moment came, she wouldn't miss. Day 10 at Fort Garnet came with a heavy sky. Overcast, still, no wind. It was the kind of weather old soldiers said always held its breath before something broke loose. The morning began like every other. Standard briefing, ammo distribution, rifle inspections. But today wasn't just another drill. It was the live fire exam. Each recruit would take the firing line solo and be graded on target precision, reload speed, and stability under pressure. Nerves buzzed like a second current in the air. Names were drawn at random. Some groaned, some cheered. Then the final name was called. Moore, you're up first. Heads turned. The silence was sharp. Rachel didn't speak. She rose slowly from her seat, walked over to the gear rack, and picked up her assigned M24. She checked the scope, tightened the sling, and walked toward the firing line with steady steps, her boots barely crunching the gravel. You sure about this? One instructor muttered under his breath. She hasn't fired a single round yet, said another. She fails this, she's out. From behind the line, Sergeant Hal Jennings crossed his arms. He wasn't smiling. Colonel Frank Dalton had shown up again that morning, ostensibly for oversight. But he'd remained near the edge of the range, observing quietly from under the shade of a corrugated steel awning. No one had spoken to him since the week began, but his presence was felt. Rachel reached the chalk mark on the ground and took her position. The targets were set standard paper silhouettes, 3 at staggered distances, 400, 600, and 800 yards. She adjusted her stance and lowered herself into the prone firing position. That's when it happened. As she lifted her arm to settle the rifle against her shoulder, the edge of her shirt caught the wind and rose, just enough to expose the full tattoo on her rib cage. The black snake, coiled tightly around a rifle cartridge, and on the bullet's casing, clear as day, were 3 characters BV-12s. Private Thomas Baker, who had mocked her earlier that week, let out a snort. Would you look at that? She even got the wannabe Special Forces ink. One of the instructors narrowed his eyes, stepping forward. Private Moore, he called, this ain't a tattoo contest. You show off like that again, I'll stop. The voice came from behind them. Calm, authoritative. Everyone turned. Colonel Dalton had moved forward. His face had changed. The casual detachment from earlier was gone. His jaw clenched slightly and his brow furrowed, not in anger, but in recognition. He stepped past the line, past the instructor, and stopped just a few feet from Rachel, still prone behind the rifle. "Let me see that mark," he said quietly. Rachel didn't move for a moment. Then, without a word, she sat up slowly and pulled her shirt slightly higher, revealing the full tattoo. Dalton bent down, his eyes narrowing. The snake, the bullet, the letters BV-12 etched with precision. He stood back slowly. "She's Black Viper," he said. Not a question, a statement. A few instructors exchanged glances, but that unit, someone started. "As dissolved after Operation Red Line," Dalton finished. His voice was tight now. Officially, none made it out. Rachel remained silent. Her eyes met his without emotion. "I remember the reports," he continued. 12 operators, all declared KIA, bodies unrecovered. Every one of them. Rachel's voice finally broke the silence. 12 went in, she said softly. "I came out alone." The range went dead quiet. For a moment, all that could be heard was the soft hum of distant HVS units from the base armory. No wind. No movement. The youngest recruits didn't fully understand what had just been said, but the older instructors, those who'd been around long enough to know the name Black Viper, went pale. It wasn't just a special unit. It was the kind of unit that didn't exist on paper. The kind that didn't get interviews or medals. The kind that got sent after the official missions failed and command had nothing left to try. Rachel turned back toward the target range. Her voice didn't shake. "You asked me before," she said, "why I hadn't fired, why I kept waiting." She lowered herself back into prone position. "It's because I needed to be sure I could do it for the right reason, that I wasn't just doing it out of habit." Sergeant Jennings stepped forward. "That mark," he said, "BV-12. That's your team's designation." Rachel didn't lift her gaze from the scope. "No," she said quietly. "It's how many I couldn't bring home." The words 12 men and women, operators, teammates, gone. And every morning since, she'd carried that number in ink, on her skin and deeper still, in her bones. Dalton looked down at the dirt beneath his boots. He'd been a lieutenant during Red Line. He remembered the radio silence, the conflicting intelligence, the last-minute change in the evac zone that went unanswered, and the final haunting line in the report, "No response. Assume full loss." Now, standing in front of him was the one they had left behind. "I read your file," he said finally, "but your name wasn't on the return list." Rachel answered without turning. "That's because there was no one left to report me." Jennings stepped back. He didn't say another word. The recruits, once full of smirks and sarcasm, were now silent. Even Baker kept his mouth shut. The only sound came from Rachel's breathing, slow, even, and the soft scrape of fabric as she adjusted her position. Then, for the first time since arriving at Fort Garnett, Rachel Moore loaded a single round into the chamber. The bolt slid forward with a confident click. She steadied her rifle, exhaled once, then again. A moment passed. Then came the shot. The sound cracked across the field like a clean break in time. The 400-yard target split dead center. No wind, no delay, no second guessing. She chambered a second round. Another shot. The 600-yard target snapped neatly, almost identically. Third round. Slight adjustment, a long pause. The 800-yard target, barely visible through the fogged glass of morning haze, fell clean with a third report, and then she stood up, slowly, calmly. No warm-up. One recruit muttered, barely audible. Rachel slung the rifle over her shoulder and turned away. Colonel Dalton gave a slow, formal salute. She didn't return it, just nodded once and said, "Tell the next one to step up. They're ready now." And then she walked off the range, leaving behind silence and 3 shattered targets. Colonel Frank Dalton hadn't spoken since the third shot. He stood by the range flagpole, arms folded tightly across his chest, staring at the paper targets Rachel had just split in half. Not one of them had torn, they had separated, cleanly. Even the wind seemed too respectful to blow through their remains. Then he stepped forward. "Private Moore," he said, his voice quieter than before. Rachel, who had just finished clearing her rifle chamber, looked up. I need to ask you something. She gave a single nod. Dalton motioned toward the bleachers at the side of the range. Walk with me. They moved together in silence, boots crunching over the gravel. When they reached the shaded edge of the bleachers, far enough that no recruits could hear, Dalton finally said what had been weighing on him all morning. Do you remember Hill 9? Rachel turned to face him. Her expression didn't change, but something in her eyes went still. March 17, she replied. Dalton blinked. You remember the date? She nodded once. Third extraction attempt. Temperatures hit 84 by noon. Winds east-southeast. You were pinned in the northeast tower. He stared at her. How do you? You had a head wound. Wrapped it with your left sleeve. You checked your ammo 17 times in 6 hours. Dalton's breath caught. She wasn't guessing. You were inside the second-floor stairwell by 14:30, she continued. Tried using your comms to call in for help twice. Your operator was already dead. Your rifle jammed at 14:47. You stripped it, cleaned it, and tried again at 14:51. The colonel's face had gone pale. He remembered all of it, every agonizing minute of that nightmare. But he'd never spoken of those details, not even in his debrief. They weren't in the reports. His voice was barely audible now. How could you know that? Rachel looked away, then slowly turned her body and pointed downrange. Clock tower. South slope. 873 yards. Dalton followed her line of sight, his gaze narrowing toward the distant hill crest just outside the base perimeter. It was barely visible, a dark bump on the horizon. I was there, she said. She paused for a moment, as if something heavy had just settled back on her shoulders. I watched you for 6 hours through a 20FX scope. Watched you count rounds. Watched you stop yourself from falling asleep. Watched you try to fix a rifle with blood in your eyes. Dalton sank slowly onto the bench behind him, as if the weight of what he'd just heard had knocked the air from his lungs. I thought we were completely alone. You were? She said. Until we weren't. He looked up again. How many shots? Rachel hesitated. 472 practice rounds, she said. Dalton blinked again. Practice. She nodded. Crosswind patterns kept shifting. I needed to know the exact drift at each yard increment. I couldn't afford to miss when the real one came. His voice cracked. So when did it happen? Rachel closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again. 5th hour. One of the last hostiles had you in his sights. You moved to the window. He was behind a broken beam. Angle was tight. I fired 1 round. Dalton looked at her stunned. You saved my life. She shook her head. I completed my objective. That's all. The silence between them stretched. Then Rachel added, You weren't supposed to see me. None of you were. We were deployed to cover fallback from a failed recon team. Our insertion wasn't logged. Dalton leaned back, rubbing his hands together. But the reports said there were 17 enemy snipers. There were, Rachel said. The intel you were given said 1. It was a trap. And you how many? I took out 11 before your team even noticed me. I didn't engage the others unless I had to. We were ordered to avoid contact unless mission critical. Dalton stared at the ground. Why didn't you tell anyone? Rachel's voice hardened just slightly. Because if you start believing your own legend, you stop calculating risk. You start assuming you're the one who's meant to survive. Dalton gave a soft, bitter laugh. And BV-12, she looked away. 12 of us went in, she said. I'm the only one who came back. I kept the number to remind me, not of who I lost, but of what happens when you think being elite makes you invincible. He said nothing for a long time. Then, quietly, I always wondered why no one found our evac zone. Why the fire stopped. Why I lived. He looked at her again. I owe you everything. Rachel didn't respond. She didn't need to. The breeze shifted again, brushing through the grass like a whisper. In the distance, the recruits were packing up their gear. Some still glanced in Rachel's direction. But now they did it with different eyes. Not suspicion, not ridicule. Respect. She turned to leave, but Dalton spoke one last time. Why come back now? Why this base? Why this training cycle? Rachel paused, her hand on the strap of her rifle. I needed to make sure, she said. Of what? That if I ever walked away for good, I left the next generation better than the last. Dalton stood. You already have. She didn't smile, but she nodded, slowly. Then she walked away, her figure shrinking against the setting sun, casting a long shadow across the gravel. And behind her, for the first time in his life, Colonel Frank Dalton saluted the back of someone who outranked him in a way no insignia could express. The next morning, just before sunrise, Fort Garnet woke to an unfamiliar stillness. The usual shuffle of boots, the clank of mess hall trays, and the sound of instructors barking orders were all missing from one corner of the base, the firing range. There, on a steel shooting bench facing the open field, sat an M24 rifle, polished to a mirror, like shine. Not a speck of dust, not a single print. Every screw torqued, every optic calibrated. It looked like a ceremonial piece, but it had been used, and used well. Beside it lay a folded piece of black cloth and a handwritten note, plain and precise, no further training needed. Just remember why you pick up a rifle in the first place. Her name wasn't on the note, but everyone knew who left it. Rachel Moore was gone. No send-off, no salute, no paperwork trail. She had arrived quietly, and now she had vanished the same way. But she didn't leave without finishing what she came to do. Inside the barracks, each recruit found an envelope on their bunk, labeled with their own name. Inside was a set of handwritten notes, all in the same tight, efficient penmanship. Each note contained a breakdown of shooting posture, breathing control, trigger pull technique, and an individualized training schedule built from the recruit's performance over the past 2 weeks. These weren't generic suggestions. They were laser-specific corrective measures, micro-adjustments, even gear recommendations for future deployment scenarios. Private Scott Richards found a line that read, "Your grip tension increases at 300 yards. Practice firing after a full sprint. You're better than you think. Prove it." Private Thomas Baker, the one who mocked her the most, stared at his note for a long time before folding it back up without a word. The last line of every note was identical. "You're better than you think." But Rachel hadn't just left behind training advice. That final night, just hours before she departed, she'd requested to address the recruits one last time. No one had expected it. But when she entered the barracks and stood by the center post, the room fell silent faster than any instructor could have managed. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't wear a uniform of rank or recognition. She just stood there, in the same worn fatigues she'd cleaned rifles in for days, and said, "You all think this is about hitting a target." She paused, scanning the faces, young, unsure, some still marked by pride, others by shame. "It's not." She let the silence hang. "This is about responsibility. Every round you fire, every trigger you squeeze, that bullet carries more than powder and steel. It carries someone's son, someone's daughter, someone's future." The room didn't move. "I used to think being a sniper meant being special," she continued. "That it meant you were the hero in the story, the one everyone would talk about, the one who saved the day with one perfect shot." She took a breath. "But real heroes don't wait in clock towers for 16 hours without food or water, hoping for a clear line. Real heroes don't carry the names of the people they couldn't save. And they don't come back home with 12 empty chairs behind them." Her words landed with a weight that couldn't be measured, not in pounds, not in distance, only in silence. Private Patterson, one of the newer recruits, raised a shaky hand. "Mom," he said, voice barely audible, "how do we become like you?" For the first time since she stepped on base, Rachel smiled. It wasn't a proud smile. It wasn't even a happy one. "You don't," she said gently. "You become better." The recruits looked at her, confused. "You become the version of me that saves everyone," she said. "The one that brings the whole team back, all 12. That's your job now." She paused at the doorway before leaving. "And if you're ever sitting next to someone who doesn't look like they belong here, who's quiet, who doesn't fire first, who just keeps showing up early and cleaning your gear, maybe take a second before you laugh." She looked over her shoulder. That person might be the one who saves your life one day. And with that, she left. She didn't leave her name. She didn't take credit. She didn't leave behind medals, ribbons, or certificates. Just a polished rifle, a folded cloth, a set of handwritten truths, and a standard that no drill manual had ever taught. Years later, When fresh recruits asked Sergeant Hal Jennings if the stories were true, if someone from Black Viper had really trained at Fort Garnet, he never answered directly. He'd just walk over to his locker, open a small fireproof case, and pull out a stack of Rachel's notes, now laminated and worn from age. "She didn't come here to learn," he'd say quietly. "She came here to teach. We were just too slow to realize it." Weeks passed, then months. The recruits at Fort Garnet moved on to advanced training. Some were selected for recon units. Others moved to aviation, logistics, or forward observer teams. The rifle range, once echoing with mockery and doubt, was now quiet, almost reverent. But Rachel Moore was not forgotten. Her name was never listed on official rosters. Her unit, Black Viper, never mentioned in graduation speeches. Her file, still marked as incomplete transfer, no medals, no commendations, just a void where her service should have been. And yet, her legacy didn't fade. Every morning, new recruits arrived to find the M24 rifle still displayed behind glass near the range entrance. Spotless, preserved, untouched. Below it sat the folded black cloth, yellowing slightly with age, and the note that had become more than just a farewell. It had become a rule. No further training needed. Just remember why you pick up a rifle in the first place. Above it, someone had quietly added a small wooden plaque. It read, "Rachel Moore, First Ghost Instructor." She didn't speak to be heard. She acted to be remembered. Those who trained with her stopped talking about her as if she were a recruit. They spoke of her the way soldiers speak of legends, softly and with the kind of reverence reserved for people who had done the hard things, not talked about them. Private Baker, now a team leader, kept Rachel's note folded in his chest pocket during every field deployment. Private Richards, who once teased her relentlessly, requested reassignment to a unit focused on battlefield trauma triage, because someone should be the one who makes sure all 12 come home. And Patterson, he became an instructor. He never raised his voice, never barked orders, but his team had the best accuracy rates of any class at Garnet. When asked how he trained them so well, he just said, "I watched someone who never fired a shot, until she had to." But perhaps the most powerful shift wasn't in performance. It was in attitude. Suddenly, the quiet ones weren't dismissed. The ones who cleaned rifles in silence weren't laughed at. The recruits who preferred notebooks over noise started getting asked for advice. Because now they all knew. The ones who say the least might carry the heaviest stories. They began to understand something older soldiers had always known but never said outright. The most dangerous person in the room is never the one who talks loud. It's the one who's quietly checking wind direction before you even notice the weather's changed. That was Rachel. She hadn't come to Fort Garnet to prove herself. She didn't need to. She came to teach, to observe, to make sure that the people who followed her, people who would one day hold rifles in places the world didn't want to talk about, understood the cost of pulling a trigger. Not the physical cost, the human one. She never once asked for respect. She simply acted like someone who didn't need it, because she had already earned it, alone on a clock tower, 173 yards away from a man who didn't even know she was saving his life. Rachel Moore was a reminder that not all ghosts are gone. Some just walk quietly beside us, waiting for the moment when silence is no longer an option. A reminder that the quiet girl in the back might be the one who's memorized every detail you forgot, just in case the worst day of your life happens and she's the only one standing between you and a flag-draped box. She was a sniper, not because she could shoot, but because she knew when not to. She didn't come home with a dozen medals. She came home without her team, and that's why she trained yours, to make sure it never happened again. So if you ever find yourself on the edge, emotionally, physically, morally, remember her note. Not the signature, not the story, just the line. Remember why you pick up a rifle in the first place. And maybe ask yourself one more question. What if the person you're ignoring right now is the one who will save your life tomorrow? Sometimes the loudest one in the room is trying to prove something, but the quiet one, they already did. Never judge someone by how much they talk, how many medals they wear, or how flashy their resume looks. Judge them by how they show up when everything is on the line. Because some people don't need to say they've been through hell. They just carry themselves like someone who came back anyway. So if you believe in second chances, in hidden strength, in quiet courage, take a second right now to honor the Rachels of the world. Leave a comment below. I will never underestimate the quiet ones again. And if this story moved you, subscribe. Because somewhere out there, there's another story like this waiting to be told. And you're exactly the kind of person who should hear it. Some people walk into a room and demand attention. Others walk in quietly, sit in the back, and change everything. Rachel Moore didn't raise her voice. She didn't brag. She didn't chase glory. But when it mattered most, when lives were on the line, she acted. Not out of pride, not out of revenge, but because she remembered why she picked up a rifle in the first place. And that's a lesson the world forgets too often. We live in a time where noise is mistaken for leadership, where being seen is often more important than being ready. But real strength, it doesn't shout, it prepares, it observes, it waits quietly until the moment it's needed. So here's what this story taught me. And maybe it will mean something to you too. Never underestimate the quiet ones. The one you overlook today might be the one who saves you tomorrow. The person sitting alone, wiping down the tools everyone else leaves dirty, might be the only one thinking 3 steps ahead when everything starts falling apart. In a world so full of noise, silence is often where the real courage lies. So if you've ever felt unseen, if you've ever been the one working quietly in the background, or if you've ever misjudged someone just because they didn't speak loud enough, let this be your reminder. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment. I'll never ignore the quiet ones again. Or simply share the name of someone you once misunderstood and now see differently. And if you believe in stories that honor the unseen heroes, the silent warriors, and the ones who carry burdens no one else knows about, subscribe to this channel. Because here, we don't just tell stories. We remember the people behind them, the quiet ones, the steady hands, the Rachel Moores of the world, and maybe, just maybe, that includes you.